So they've given me paper, they've said it's like jolt to paint like that, and then I'll do right and we think like there's a batch of paint as well. They've given me painkillers, and then it started to kick in, and so hopefully, sorry for that.
We're still on time, so I think that's overlays. Okay, I'll first start with giving the result, justify the result, and if there's any time left, I'll start to do some feedback, and I'll clearly delineate when I can do feedback as opposed to justification of the result. So, in the end, we decided to give the first to technical government, the second to open, the third to closing opposition, and fourth portion to open opposition. First, generally, the proposition versus the opposition, because it was a prop suite, we thought that something generically that made the prop teams, both of them, strong with any of the teams, was I think the clarity and practicality of the examples. I think both opposition teams were quite abstract and theoretical in a debate that, from the prop side, had some very compelling, down-to-earth examples of things that went bad or went good. So I think, in general, that's something I want to say about the health and persuasiveness of the proposition arguments. They were more practical, and I'll come to that later, but it's something to see in light of what happened there. Okay. So, first, let me start on the opposition side, why we decided to give you guys the third over fourth on the opening position. The key reason there was I think both teams spent most of their energy on proving the inclusiveness or minority representation. Secondarily, I think there was a generic argument of more choice is always good, which I think wasn't developed well enough to be a major part of the debate. I think it got to that level saying choice is always good, but we didn't get enough of an analysis behind that point to say, okay, why does choice inherently improve democracy, other than referring to the kind of inclusiveness of minority interest. Only minority interest kind of inclusiveness clash. I think in the end we decided that second opposition significantly improved and analysed the argument better than an opening opposition. This was specifically, I think, because both teams could have used more practical examples, but for example, the analysis in the whip speech of LGBT interests in Republican parties in the United States, reacting to some of the material coming out of the government was good and made it more practical. Also the reason how coalition politics work and how you can get minority interests to show in these coalition politics, I think added some real meat to the argument. And the idea about how, on the comparative, the kind of advocacy within a broader party argument on the proposition side, we got some real responses at the closing, which is why we think that they in the end, although we did think that opening opposition brought that point well and had the structure of all the main elements, including choice, including minority interest, we think that because of these mechanisms that were in closing, we think that in the end they took the point over opposition there. On the second and third, so between opening government and closing opposition, I think there was one direct clash, which was on the inclusiveness and minority interest argument. There were some arguments that were no direct clashes, where we think on the argument of taking responsibility specifically, that it was something you guys set up in the beginning and it stood throughout the debate, and it wasn't necessarily challenged at all, or only in a limited set that some of the opposition teams said, we don't think responsibility taking is that of an essential thing because we think minority parties should be able to got government to go against their core interest. This kind of core idea of you can't dodge your responsibility, the majority party stood from the beginning to the end of the debate, and this was your point, and we gave you credit for that, which is a big reason why that was why you took the second over the third in closing opposition. The inclusiveness argument, we think both teams brought points. We think in terms of the energy and length of the attention, we think closing spent much more attention on inclusiveness, but in the end, we don't think there was enough of a response to some of the issues on inclusiveness brought out through proposition speeches, particularly an analysis of why it is per definition impossible to have this kind of broad tent party including elements of diversity. I think that kind of response was necessary in order for us to really compare some of the issues. At the end of the debate, I think we were convinced by the opposition that it was definitely possible or even likely that a coalition or multi-party type government would properly show minority interests, but we weren't convinced that it was necessarily more difficult to do so under a two-party system. And we thought both systems could conceivably show minority interests quite well, and each could conceivably be inclusive systems. So we think, in the end, we were convinced by the arguments that multi-party systems did this well. We weren't necessarily convinced by the more rebuttal-style arguments that two-party systems don't do it quite well or are very hard to show minority interests quite in that way, particularly the type of arguments made by first government already in terms of why very extreme minority parties might like to be included in the Big Ten party because they can get their moderate versions into coalition government programs, or Big Ten government programs. Those types of issues were never, I think, effectively dealt with on the opposition side. So I think that was a key why you could say it over. On the comparative here, we thought there were, I think this wasn't clear immediately, so we had to really go into some kind of detail to show why you took the first instead of the second. The first issue was that on the kind of lines of argumentation brought by the opposition, we thought that the kind of reform or policy and governance type of arguments that second spent more attention on, even though they were already brought by first, we thought there were the stronger arguments linked to the notion why we should enact this policy. The type of responsibility issues, why we liked it and get credit for it, weren't necessarily linked well enough to, okay, why should I care about this so much that this in itself is a good enough reason to enact this policy. So that was a big reason why we gave second warn, especially because why we in the end decided also to give them the most credit for the policy-oriented arguments or the governance-type arguments of stability of government. We did think that the Belgium example, for example, came out of the first competition already. We don't think it was analysed well enough or developed well enough to give you full credit for the stability issues that were really analysed in the member of government speech. We also think that second proposition had a significant extension in terms of the fractured opposition argument, where a strong two-party system leads necessarily to a stronger opposition and voice its point. We didn't necessarily, however, give credit to some smaller points made in between lines, where there wasn't much attention paid to in the member with government speeches, such as CDU traits or interests, or that all party have better scientific institutes. So those types of issues, I think, weren't essential to the case, but we think on the broad stability of government issues, this was we think that was well developed enough and more central to the case. They were able to give you the first instead of the second. Right. Seeing as we have some time, I may just give a couple of points of feedback. I think that will hopefully be shared by everyone. Firstly, I think this was around, well, I can very clearly hopefully explain use of examples in debating how to respond to that conflict. First, for both opposition teams, if the government side brings an example and says, in this kind of weighing two sides debates, you need to deal with all the examples and throw out enough. Because you were very much hampered on both sides by the fact that all of the examples in the debate were proper examples. I don't think opposition introduced any examples of its own, where, for example, I think Germany is a very good example of the opposite, where you have nice, stable coalition governments, or a middle-of-the-road party, which is not a special interest party, which is an minority party, right? So those types of arguments are these relatively good examples as well. So adding more examples to the debate is a good one, and also responding specifically as to not only the truth of an example, so how in Belgium coalition government works, but also the relevance, because I think in Belgium it's quite an extreme example in this case, and proposition got away quite easily by saying, oh, Belgium's a mess, therefore coalition governments don't work. I think quite an easy answer to get away with, and score lots of points very easily on the position side. Say, look, Belgium is an extreme example. We don't think any of the other 26 majority coalition governments in Europe have any kind of problem like it. So those types of responses, specifically dealing with examples, getting other examples out there, really could have made the opposition case a lot stronger. I think opposition got away with a lot of this kind of example shopping in this debate, and they shouldn't have. It wasn't necessary, and I think it doesn't unnecessarily cost the other in this debate. So that's one generic point of feedback I really do want to highlight. So practically write down all lists of countries. Our debates do the same. write down a list of countries and tick whether you mentioned them or right. These types of practical things really do make a difference, especially in debate, which was a reasonable level like this one. And the other points that were good. Yeah, I think the feedback point which shows from some of you, which I think was particularly relevant to not only convince me but to convince all judges in the panel, is to make sure you tell us in the first 10 seconds of your speech what you're going to do. I think for some speakers, I had to take a lot of time to understand where exactly you were going with the event, whether you were going more to inclusive sides, whether you were taking some of the governance points. So really do give me quite clearly where you're heading to in order to make me write down more of your points and in a more structured manner immediately. Other points that I can share for everyone otherwise no, that was it from my side. So thank you all for what was an individual debate and hopefully in the future. And feel free to come up to any of us